Hello and welcome to Libero, the podcast about the least important of the most important things, as Bruce Rioch once told David Platt, a man who didn't like standing around with his cock in his hands. I will explain that story at a later date. I asked for lots of comments and ratings on Jack Pitt-Brooke's Maddie Thatcher special, and you, the listener, delivered. It would be great for this episode if you could better the 56 comments on Spotify and increase the incredible volume of 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts that we got for our little celebration of neoliberalism. I didn't actually write this bit, it's very good. This isn't just for our egos, it really does help others discover the podcast and keep this thing on the road. We like nice comments, likes, and people who subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Today's a very globe-spanning edition of Libero, just while I'm sitting where I'm always sitting these days, which is in Yorkshire, where it's grey and cloudy. Jonathan Wilson and Miguel Delaney are in much more interesting places. Let's start with Jonathan. Where are you?
Still in Buenos Aires, still doing this documentary. Just to reaffirm, I have not and have never been and probably will never go to the Falkland Islands. But yeah, yesterday I interviewed Enzo Francescoli, who I
That is good. That is good.
That is very Libero.
I was nervous for it in a way that I haven't been nervous for you in a long time. And there is something about people who are famous when you were kids, that they mean a lot more than, if I had an interview with Erling Haaland, it would be a big work thing and I'd be sort of anxious to do it well because it's a big opportunity, but I wouldn't be nervous about meeting Erling Haaland. Whereas Enzo Francescoli walks into a room and you're sort of like, oh, Jesus, it's Enzo Francescoli. I realised there was a thing about being a kid. I think it must have been 2018. I was on TalkSport to do something on the 50th anniversary of United winning the European Cup. And only when I went on air did I realise the person who I was speaking to was Darren Gough. And I suddenly was thinking, I'm talking to Darren Gough. Which is obviously, these days, Darren Gough's just a bloke on TalkSport. But yeah, he probably was England's greatest cricketer, or say his greatest bowler of the 1980s.
It is absolutely true, though. I find that even like when sometimes you're in like press rooms or whatever, the modern players go by who obviously are now much more famous, really, than anyone from the past almost. And like, it's just, there's a bloke I cover. Whereas then you see some star from the 90s who's inexplicably doing media. Like, what fucking hell? Look who it is. It's similar actually when you try and talk to them in some ways. I mean, I interviewed Baggio in 2017, and like I was a bit like Wilson there. I was a bit nervous because it's Baggio. I was like 10 when USA 94 happened. Similarly, before the 2014 World Cup, since it was the 20th anniversary of 94, I tried to speak to Hristo Stoichkov, and I WhatsApped him, and initially he was agreeable, and I was a minute late for our allotted time, and he bollocked me, which was quite an honour.
Well, Hristo Stoichkov bottled out of a game of table football against me at the Portugal camp at Euro 2004, where they had a table football table. He was playing. I went over and said, can I play the winner? He won, and then he refused to take me on. A coward, Hristo Stoichkov.
He can just settle with his Ballon d'Or and his Champions League medal, I suppose.
The good man Wilson and the coward Stoichkov. I've also interviewed Hristo Stoichkov, but I was on time. But I remember being nervous around before that. And funny enough, Miguel, I read your Baggio piece yesterday for something else I'm working on. It was very good.
Thank you.
I very much enjoyed it. I have ripped it off unashamedly. Mids, you are, I think regular listeners will know, but new listeners might not. You are in Riga, where you and Jack have been on a stag do. And that is, if anyone's watching the video, it looks a lot like Miguel's been taken hostage. We think he hasn't. He's just in a hotel room where he's closed the curtains to create a sort of more intimate feel. That is now, obviously England qualified for the World Cup and stuff yesterday, but crucially, Miguel, that means you've been to all of the Baltics, which means I can ask you which one is best.
I think that'd be very unfair on our Baltic friends. I have to say, the one thing I've noticed about Latvia is, and one of the reasons that when they're closed, it's very grey out. Since we got here, it's basically grey and drizzle. Actually, heavier than drizzle. It's one of those rains where you're in it for a minute and you're drenched. It's been enjoyable though. All great countries.
All great countries. Wouldn't want to pick.
Yeah. Estonia very different to Latvia and Lithuania, I would say.
In what way?
I think it's pretty well known as the Estonians consider themselves Finnish, not Baltic, or it does have a very different feel. The language and that is completely different. Latvians seem to think the Estonians are arrogant, from what I was speaking to, or certainly wealthier.
This is high grade Libero content where we're just sort of making grand sweeping generalizations about small nations.
For a country I've been in for 48 hours.
Speaking as someone who's been in Latvia for 2 days, they find the Estonians arrogant.
I mean, that's
Whether
what
they've
someone said to me, to be fair. So I'm relaying an
You've got
opinion.
a terrible attitude problem. Obviously, yeah. So England have made it to the World Cup. Congratulations, well done, Thomas. I think we were all thrilled by the wins against Wales and Latvia. Miguel, you said on the previous edition, the excellent Bellingham edition of Libero earlier this week, which I think if you've not listened to, you should go and listen to, that people generally find the international break quite dull. I think that is a very first world perspective of fans, because I think if you look around the international break this time around, it's been pretty good. There's some decent stories out there, not least the fact that Sweden, who have this incredibly strong strike force and decent midfield, are being actively sabotaged by a Dane, which I find very funny. John Dahl Tomasson is the manager. The Swedes have managed to lose home and away to Kosovo. They're bottom of that group. I think, do they have a backdoor in through the Nations League playoffs or something? But they are having a rough old time of it.
Which is on the previous point, and I think the Sweden one illustrates this. It's not so much the international break is doing what it is, if you're just like covering a big team, hammering people, and with no stakes. It's more like, as we know, and as we feared before the Bellingham episode a little bit, it doesn't translate into popularity in the way big clubs do. So hence, like, there's always more focus on the big clubs. But I do think one of the reasons this international week was better, of course, because, or why it felt more interesting, is because there's stakes. For most of the 2 years in between tournaments, and tournaments are the one thing in football that match the big clubs in terms of kind of interest and engagement. But like, it'd be kind of empty, meaningless football for 2 years in between. Okay, mostly for the big nations, not for the rest. But now, as we get closer to the World Cup itself, this is where we actually see the emotion of it all. Because, I mean, getting through or missing out on the World Cup are these huge stories. Suddenly it all starts to feel real, and you can start to visualize the tournament and who's in danger. I must say, I do feel it's quite a thin top end at the moment to this potential World Cup field. I think there's only about 5 or 6 good teams. Now, to be fair, I would have said there was about 8 or 9 really, really good sides before 2002, and look what happened there.
Yeah, funnily enough, I think that's probably right. Like, it feels something like England and Spain, and I suppose the French, to an extent, are kind of the only European nations in any kind of decent... Yeah, but it's Portugal, and they've got great players, but, it's Portugal. Yes, they look good, that's fair. But, like, the Belgians aren't brilliant, the Dutch aren't amazing, the Germans are struggling a bit. Brazil obviously aren't kind of what you would want Brazil to be. Argentina, Jonathan, your new homeland, they sailed through qualification. I've no idea how they've done in the friendlies. But I did speak to Jefferson Montero a little while ago, the former Swansea winger, and he reckons Ecuador are making the semis of the World Cup as South America's third force, yeah.
They finished second in Commonwealth qualifying now. I mean, to an extent, it doesn't matter because so many qualify that I think a lot of teams didn't take it all that seriously. And Brazil had an awful run in the middle of it, and I think they definitely have improved under Ancelotti. I think Brazil actually probably will be quite good. Africa, I think, has been interesting this week. I felt very sorry for Benin. He'd had a great qualifying campaign, and if they'd beaten Nigeria yesterday, would have made it. And they got beat 4-0, and Victor Osimhen scored a hat-trick and proved his quality. And South Africa had been... It's a great African story in that South Africa had looked miles ahead. Turned out they played a player who'd had 2 yellow cards in a game against, I think, was it Rwanda they played him against? So that game was awarded, or was it Lesotho? That game was awarded 3-0 against them. Suddenly their lead at the top of the group goes. They draw against Zimbabwe at the weekend, as the pressure's on. And you're one of those classic 0-0s where they hit the woodwork twice with a couple of shots cleared off the line, and you thought the door was open for Benin. And then Nigeria have sneaked into the playoffs so much through the back door. The only reason they're there, and this is literally true, is because Eritrea withdrew, which meant they had to slightly modify the rules for how you get in the playoffs. So your results against the bottom teams in the group no longer count, because obviously Eritrea are not in their group, so you had to reduce the numbers somehow. And if those games against the bottom club and the bottom team in the group had counted, Nigeria wouldn't be in the playoffs, but they are in the playoffs. And I mean, no disrespect to Nigeria here, but I really hope DR Congo goes through that, because I think they actually have been really good and slightly unfortunate to finish behind Senegal.
Yeah, as someone who's more invested in African qualifying than I maybe normally would be, I've written about Nigeria and DR Congo recently. DR Congo is a really kind of inspiring, uplifting story. Nigeria is not. But I suppose the other thing, in Nigeria and Cameroon are both in that playoff, and that's the playoff to get into the Intercontinental playoff. So there's still quite a lot of steps to get through for all concerned. But look, we're not here to flog the dead horse of international football too much. The fact that these games are all over means the Barclays is about to come back, and that is something that we have in access to enough data to know that's what listeners want. That's what people are interested in. Just the Barclays. 3 journalists making big statements about members of the Red Cartel. And seeing as we've already done Liverpool and United, we are now going to turn our laser-like biased focus onto Arsenal, the team that have managed so far this season to overcome their main rival, PGMOL, to sit top of the Premier League. And we're going to ask why, whether, how they are treated differently to everybody else, which is something I think that quite a lot of their fans think. I think the best way to start that conversation is to point out that basically everyone agrees, and stop me if this is wrong, basically everyone agrees that Arsenal have the strongest squad in the Premier League, that they have an extremely good coach, they are kind of an avatar for where the modern Premier League is in terms of the way that they're set up, the way that they play, and they are a lot of people's tip for the title. And that is all apparently not enough for a small section of Arsenal's online fan base who still feel they're being disrespected. Is that me being slightly too cynical, Jonathan?
Have they got the best squad? I mean, they've definitely got one of the 2 or 3 best squads. Yeah, probably they have in terms of depth. Got the best squad. Yeah, it's true that there's an element of their online fan base who don't do the club any favors by being so hysterical about everything, and it is fair to say we as journalists should be able to look beyond that. But it's also true that a lot of the Arsenal fans who happen to sit quite near the press box are quite hysterical. So maybe we get a false impression. But they finished second 3 years in a row. I think I'm right in saying that's only happened 5 times before in English football. So the other 5 have gone on to win the league.
This is a tangent. Who are the other 5?
Preston.
Yeah,
Arsenal.
United did it under Busby. United finished second 4 years out of 5 under Busby before the first title they won under him.
Amazing to think that he'd have been written off as a loser.
Yeah, Plymouth finished second 5 years in a row in Division 3 South before finally claiming promotion in the late 20s. Everybody who wrote off that Plymouth side as they just don't have what it takes. They don't have the inner steel to get over the line. How foolish they were made to look. Miguel.
Loads of people down at Home Park raging about the haters.
Yeah,
But, it's actually only 4 teams. 4 teams before this Arsenal.
Yeah.
They are Preston, 1890 to 93, won a title in 89. United, 46 to 49, won a title in 51. So you think 49-50, that would have been a bad season for Sir Matt and the discourse around, whether he's a loser.
not Sir Matt at that point, of course.
Of
Just
course,
Matt.
yeah. Leeds, 69-72, had won the title in 69 itself, so they went into that run as champions. And Arsenal, 98 to 2001, kind of bookended by 2 very different Wenger teams. But I do, for all kind of, we're talking about hysterics there. The issue with Arteta, I think it's specifically Arteta more than the club right now, more than the team, is that he hasn't won the League of the Champions League. And until that happens, it feels like every single thing is a referendum on Arsenal in a way that is sometimes actually, I would feel, a little bit over the top. So actually the City game this season pointed to a lot, because this was a game where basically Guardiola, in a way that would have been unimaginable, certainly 15 years ago when he played Inter, basically completely adapts his style to face Arteta's Arsenal. Basically does a Mourinho Inter against Guardiola's Barca. 5-4-1, cramming the box, Haaland booting the ball away, running on the counterattacks. And yet a lot of the discussion after that game was about Arsenal's approach, Arsenal's lineup, and how they approached the game, which does feel a little bit like that. And it was Arteta. All right, fair enough, he probably got the lineup wrong, but it felt a little bit much that it was Arteta being criticised for being conservative in that game, given that it's Guardiola who's actually compromising a lifestyle. But of course, that's connected to the fact they have to get over the line. And I think that all of that, and actually it's interesting. So I know a lot of the Arsenal dressing room are quite agitated about how they're covered, how they're spoken about. But then that possibly is a reflection of a certain not anxiety, agita, as Corrado Soprano would say, about the fact they haven't won the league in 21 years. Hence, in that City game as well, in the first half, after the lineup was announced, as they struggled to open City, you could feel this nervous energy in the stadium. It wasn't so bad in the second half, but I think that's how some of this online discussion as we talk about actually can manifest and start to affect the reality. And it's why almost everything Arteta does feels a referendum on his management.
I think you're absolutely right, Miguel, that after that game, it was slightly weird the focus on Arteta and not Guardiola. But I think the reason for that was because at Anfield a couple of weeks earlier, he had picked an extremely defensive or a more defensive team than seemed reasonable. Yeah, that was a Liverpool team who looked vulnerable and, as it turns out, have subsequently been vulnerable, who had Szoboszlai at right back, Kirk as a left back, one of them not a full back, one of them who's looked very, very uncomfortable since his move. And yet there was no attempt to have a go at them early on. Madueke had a couple of runs, but they didn't seem to have any sort of urgency to get the ball to Madueke. And it almost felt in that game where Liverpool are not there for the taking, but they're there to have a swing out and see what happens, put them under pressure, see if they crack. And they didn't do that, but let Liverpool play their way into the game. Liverpool in the second half had 2/3 of the ball before they scored, which is 82 minutes, like the Szoboszlai free kick. And you just felt in that game that Arteta's caution had let Liverpool off, that there was an opportunity to get at them and they hadn't taken it. So I think it was a sort of a continuation of that vibe. The fact that he then had to make substitutions at half time against City, that it seemed sort of a reasonable thing to criticise him for.
That is an interesting aspect. So I think there's three things that I think we could maybe start to get into on Arsenal, three sides of this conversation. That is maybe the least of them. So let's start with that. That'll keep the listeners engaged. It's interesting, isn't it, that this Arsenal, what they've come to stand for, is totally at odds with what Arsenal were for a generation. That there is a real kind of dourness and toughness that they are characterised as, which I think to an extent, and I suspect you both agree, is slightly unfair on Arsenal. That they're accused of this kind of caution, this negativity, not being willing enough to toe-to-toe with their peers. But I guess, is that not a natural reaction to where they were when Arteta took over? If you think back to late era Wenger Arsenal, they were a soft touch. It had gone from that fast show, I think it's a fast show sketch of Arsenal. Oh no, is it the IT crowd? They always try and walk the ball into the net. That sketch of these are kind of these cosseted, soft artists who don't really like it up them. That was late era Wenger Arsenal. And what Arteta has clearly, I think, set out to do is to remedy that by making them, and I mean this as a compliment, like the most obdurate team in the Premier League.
Wenger, as great as he was, let's be fair, from close to the end of the 2000s, around 2007, 08, you've essentially got a decade of Wenger's Arsenal who very frequently provide humiliating calamities. Like there are a lot of them, from Birmingham in the Cup, losing 8-2 to United. You can point to so many of these sort of big games where there's some sort of like they've lost in a way that they just shouldn't have lost. And that obviously then culminated in Arsenal being a massive basket case when Arteta took over. I do think that he didn't go to this obdurateness straight away. Like, I think they played exceptional football around 22-23, their first sort of title race with City. But then the manner they fell apart, it laid on, which I think was a little bit, because they did get 83 points that season, which they probably shouldn't have been capable of at that point. But they just naturally kind of overextended themselves and were a bit too naive for a really canny City and got hammered at City. And of course, then you can get into the bigger debates about like City's, the wage bills, the power and all that. So I think Arsenal did overperform, but he responded to that then by gradually kind of improving, I suppose, the heft of the team. And I guess they've got like so many players, even those who aren't over 6 foot, and there are less and less of them. They're like someone like Jurriën Timber is like, he's a really strong physical specimen. I do think they still play when they have all their best players there. And I thought it was instructive in the West Ham game that he did start with Odegaard and Eze in midfield with Rice behind. Although Zubimendi came on and did actually change the game. I think Zubimendi's superb. He still will play this approach that other opposition managers do think is like possibly the best in the league in how Arsenal move you around, how they dominate you. But as we saw with the Liverpool game, he is also willing to temper it with some real pragmatism. And I mean, you could say that's an Arsenal of a few faces now.
Jonathan does not want to say anything about that, apparently. Yeah, I think that is true. And that's the common conception, isn't it, Jonathan? That that first title race with City is kind of evil Mikel Arteta's origin story. That's effectively how it works. That he realises that they're not big enough and strong enough and tough enough and, kind of solid enough to go the distance in those games, I think. That seems to be the received wisdom, that they can't stand up to City in an individual match. So he kind of retools the whole squad, the whole team, to be able to do that. And the flip side is that Arsenal have lost a little bit of their kind of sprinkling of magic that I think in those early seasons under Arteta, they did have.
Yeah, I mean, I think it partly is specifically the matchup with City, but I think there's also been a habit with this Arsenal side of, certainly, I mean, I guess all teams do it to an extent, but when you narrowly miss out on the title, maybe you notice it more, maybe it stings more, that they do leave some cheap points out there. And this is a point that Arsenal fans have criticised me for making. It's true. So, come and have a go again. Just make sure you leave comments so that we get the algorithmic benefits when you do it. Because that's how social media works, right? That's 2 seasons ago, so the game against Brentford, when they were totally all over Brentford, then Raya makes a mistake on the stroke of half time, they concede, and that game ends in panic. And there's no need for it to end in panic. If they just kept playing, they'd have won it quite easily. That setbacks seem to sort of shake them, which I guess, it's understandable that neurosis exists when it has been so costly. You think even the last season, and the day when it felt like the title was decided was that day in late January when Liverpool were drawing at Brentford. Liverpool kick off at 3 p.m, drawing at Brentford, and then everybody, Arsenal were playing Villa in the 5:30 game, and everybody at Arsenal was thinking this is a chance to close the gap. And then Darwin Nunez scores twice in injury time, late in injury time at Brentford, 95, 97 or something. And so that Arsenal game starts with a sense of, at best, we can maintain the gap. They're 2-0 up, and then they have 10 minutes of madness when they concede 2 goals, and Villa hit the post as well. So we could easily have lost that game. And so what had looked like being a chance to close the gap by 2 points becomes the gap widens by 2 points. So it's like a 4-point swing in the space of a couple of hours. And that's, it seems to keep happening to them. And I think that caution, the first time I was really aware of it, of this sense of over-caution, I mean, I don't think caution itself is necessarily a bad thing, but them being needlessly cautious, was the season before last, the game at the Etihad, a couple of months before the end of the season, when Arsenal had the better of the game, they were drawing, 20 minutes to go. It was like, this is a chance. Arsenal were ahead in the title race. This is a chance to put clear water between you, to give you the opportunity to slip up. Because, we all know City are capable of putting together a run of 10 wins in a row, as they subsequently did. And they didn't go for it in that final 20 minutes. They like, we'll preserve our lead, we'll draw this 0-0. And then, of course, Arsenal, they didn't collapse, but they did lose to Villa. And that let City in. And you think that 20 minutes, if they'd gone for it, sure, there's a risk that City pick you off on the break. But sometimes to win the title, you do have to take a risk. You do have to say, this is the moment to stand up and let something decisive happen and trust ourselves that it's going to be decisive in the right way.
So at the risk of going off on a wild tangent to bring us back to that point, you know how everyone in England thinks Atletico Madrid are incredibly defensive? That it's like Simeone's football, it's tough, sit back, they've got garra, they fight, all that stuff. And that's not true if you watch them in La Liga. Atletico Madrid in La Liga are quite an attacking team because they generally have the ball more against Alaves and Leganes and stuff like that. And in the same way as everyone in England thinks Lautaro Martinez is dreadful because they only ever see him play in the Champions League where he is trying to score goals against the best teams in the world.
He misses a lot of chances, come on.
Yeah, all right. No, I'm not saying Lautaro Martinez is the reincarnation of Eusebio, but he's clearly not a dreadful footballer. Like, he is an elite level striker. He might not be the best in the world, but he is he has been a reliable goal scorer in Serie A for one of the most difficult leagues defensively still, to score a lot of goals.
His placing in the Ballon d'Or ranking was eye-catching, let's put it that way.
Where was he?
7th or something.
Yeah. That's fine for Lautaro. We should be on as
7th best player in the world.
As 3 people who were in a group of 4 who went to Racing in Argentina 7 years ago, Jonathan, to have a nice chat with the people running Racing about the way they found players. I've always been on the side of Lautaro Martinez. He is a player I like. But there is a perception, as there was with Zlatan for a long time, that these players aren't very good because whenever we see them, they're not scoring goals. And at no point does anybody say, but they're not scoring goals in the Champions League semi-finals. It's quite hard to score goals in the Champions League semi-finals. Is there not a point at which that Arsenal performance against City, which lives on as a meme, I think it's AFTV kind of celebrating the goalless draw, or the 1-1, whatever it was, the draw. There's the kind of the end of the live stream and they're kind of going, right, well done Arsenal, they're clapping. Has that not created a slightly false impression because that's the game that everybody watched, that Arteta is overly cautious? He probably was in that game. I don't know how true it is other than that. I think that...
No, but if you're going to win a title, there comes a tide in the affairs of man when taking to the flood leads on to fortune. Was it not William Shakespeare who said that? So sometimes you've got to grasp the nettle. You've got to seize the bull by the horns. You've got to say that this is our time. We've got to do it now. And achievement never comes without risk. And that day they didn't do it.
I think sometimes, I mean, this is another discussion you could have, the consequence of these games can be overstated. I always remember 13-14, Mourinho's Chelsea did Pellegrini City twice, home and away. Ivanovic scores at the Etihad, and it's seen as this, well, that's what Mourinho's all about. He gets it done. City won the title. They got more points over the line. Similarly with that 23-24 season, Arsenal did get 89 points. Every other manager who's got 89 points over a season, and I'm not saying they've won it with 89 points, but have got to that level, they've also won it. They've been good enough to win the title. Like, that should be the sort of number that wins the title. Of course, they were up against a City, and because this is pretty crucial context there, a City who at that point were European champions, treble winners, and obviously are at a different stage of development. There's an argument now, obviously, they were on the downward cycle at that point, but Arsenal were on the up. And I do think, given that they started the 21-22 season getting hammered by City, like destroyed, and then a year later, so if we're going from August 2021 to August 2022, a year later, they actually become a title challenger. I think they actually developed a bit too fast. They were learning. So what you're talking about there, that 23-24 season, they were still kind of just getting to grips with it all. And from speaking to people within the club, I suppose this conditions my view a little bit. They would say about that Villa game you mentioned, what happened there was that fell in between two quarter-final legs against Bayern Munich. This is their first Champions League quarter-final in years. And within the team, they sensed a real nervous energy that they weren't ready to face Bayern. They put too much into that game. And they'd really learned from that for last season against Real Madrid. And then the Villa game they just didn't have the kind of the mental bandwidth to do it, and hence Emery just picked them off basically. And that's where the title in the Champions League was lost in a week basically, because it was a team developing, which I suppose is why we are talking about where we are. That last season, City dropped off. That was their big chance, and Liverpool just steal in. Well, not steal in. They actually they won it quite convincingly. Although I do think there are caveats for last season that Arteta has sought to address in this year, and squad depth is one of them.
So I think that brings us quite nicely onto the second thing around Arsenal that I found really interesting, which is a failure of football in general to understand comparative success. It's something that American sports do much better, because there are ways you can succeed in America without winning the big shiny trophy. You can win a divisional championship. You can have a winning record. You can bat .500, whatever that means. Whereas in football, certainly for those elite clubs, the members of the Red Cartel, if you don't win a big shiny trophy at the end, one of the main two, just ultimately we can all pretend that Arteta's FA Cup in his first full season or his first season, we can all pretend that that's a major honour, but no one is taking, and it's the FA Cup's important, but 5-6 years on, no one is thinking, well, he's won the FA Cup, so this has been a successful tenure. We are really bad, I think, at understanding how hard it is to do what Arsenal have done. So it feels to me like there are question marks over Arteta as a manager that kind of ignore where Arsenal were when he found them and where they are now.
I think that's fair. I think the fear that Arsenal fans will have, or the thing that the critics of Arteta would suggest, and I'm not including myself in that group, is that he's a great manager to develop a club to this stage, but is he, quote unquote, a winner? And I think that concept of being a winner is, I think that's where we can tie ourselves in knots a bit, and we can ignore the fact that sometimes you can be really good and not win. It's not because you've somehow lacked some inner steel or something. I remember when Rory McIlroy was coming through and he went to speak to Jack Nicklaus about, becoming a great winner. And I looked up at the time Jack Nicklaus's record, and he had won more tournaments than anybody else, obviously, because he's the greatest golfer of all time. He'd also finished second more than anybody else and finished third more than anybody else. He wasn't a great winner. He's just really, really good at golf. A great winner would be somebody who, 80% of the time when he got a chance of winning a tournament, he won it, which just wasn't true in Nicklaus. He just kept playing really good golf, and often the other golfers weren't as good as him. So what would concern me, the question I'd have is examples like that game at the Etihad, and I think Miguel's a bit kind to him there. I think that really was an opportunity missed, and I felt it even at the time, which I think is often the test of it. Was this what I was thinking at the time, or was it something that I'd kind of rationalized post hoc? But even at the time when he sat back, I was sort of thinking, I'm not, if this was your opportunity, you were on top here. And I think that's something that maybe with data, we've slightly lost the capacity to sort of smell the temperature of the game, to gauge the temperature of the game, to smell the mood of the game. And actually, I think a manager who I've criticised a lot, who was very good at that, was Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. That's the question mark. And has the caution that has been generated by the near misses, has that become counterproductive? In the way, for instance, that Guardiola often overthought Champions League games because the Champions League kept on tripping him up, often for things that had nothing to do with Guardiola, but that sort of gave him this complex about the competition, and he began to overthink it. I think the argument against Arteta's overthinking is his way of playing is now the way that everybody seems to be trying to emulate.
I do definitely think it is absolutely true. There is this idea of an instinct for how to win a game, to get you over the line, which I suppose feeds in to the concept of a winner, which, and it's interesting because while we talk about the idea of kind of smelling a win less now, equally at the same time, I think the idea of a winner can be overstated. I always find my kind of thoughts in this are tempered by exactly that kind of golf point. Or I think Michael Jordan's even said the same sort of stuff about how it's not about finishing second. It's about just not letting it affect you. It's about and top sports people have to almost be deluded in the sense that they forget about failures immediately. And even in that context, remember, look at Ferguson. We're talking about someone I would consider probably the greatest manager of all time. Obviously a winner. And yet he did have some title races that if they were done by any other manager, they were considered like jokes. That like 2011-12, especially given his local neighbours who he derided for years were involved, that's actually a pretty calamitous fall. They were 8 points clear with something like 6 games to go. I might have the numbers exactly wrong. But of course, no one looks at it in those terms. And also in that season, they lost to City twice, including in a running game, which feels very un-Fergie-like because, of course, no one looks at it in those terms because he has won 13 league titles, which someone like Arteta hasn't done. And it's like, I do wonder whether it's not so much about the idea of being a winner or not being a winner, or at least not mostly about that. It's more, the longer you go without winning, doubt starts to manifest. I think that might be the bigger issue. That it's why the landmark of a win is so important, because it affects the psychology of a team. And it's why, hence, until Arsenal actually do it, this is going to weigh over the team until then.
I want to come back to that after the break about that kind of the mood around Arsenal. I think that's really important in a way that isn't necessarily given credit. But just before we do, Jonathan, you mentioned that Arteta's style is now the kind of, it's en vogue in the Premier League. That I think is undisputably true, that there seems to have been a really sudden shift to everybody thinking actually the way Arsenal play is the way that we want to emulate. And it's seems to be less about kind of a style of play. It's no one's talking about juego de posición with Arsenal, although I'm sure that they do play juego de posición, whatever that is. But it's that focus on defensive solidity, fine, that's an eternal thing. Set pieces, kind of turning as many moments in the game into set pieces as possible, whether that's throw-ins or kickoffs or whatever. He does seem to have in a much more subtle and much briefer way than Guardiola, he seems to have kind of pioneered the modern style of Premier League play. That is, we are all students of Arsenal now, aren't we? Like there's 19 teams in the league, maybe not 19, but there's more than there's a dozen at least teams in the league who are trying to do a version of what Arteta's done, which, and I think we've touched on this before, is partly because it works, but it's also partly because no one has any time to do any actual coaching.
I think that's the key point. I guess there's two things going on. So, and we did an episode on this, didn't we, a couple of months ago, which if you want a full discussion, is go back and listen to that. But just to summarize that, this maybe is a point we didn't go into quite as much then as we could have done. But that interview Guardiola gave last season, where he talked about how his football wasn't modern football anymore, that modern football has been played by Bournemouth, Newcastle, Brighton, Liverpool. If you actually look at that, I went back and looked at that interview a couple of weeks ago, and if you read the full context of it, and I'd been guilty of this, and I think a lot of people were, of thinking what he was saying was juego de posición had become predictable, and running with the ball was needed to add a sort of a dash of something a bit unusual, something that's harder to counter. And maybe there is an element of that there. But his main point is there is no time. That the calendar is so packed now that you can't have the specific drilling for specific games that you need for juego de posición, which juego de posición is sort of turning the game into a chess match. How do we set up situations where we manipulate the game so we have overloads? So it's very much based on, it's reactive. It's based on what do the opposition do. So you have to learn what the opposition do. You have to work out the weakness, and then you have to find a way that you can target that. But if you're playing 2 big games a week and a lot of travel involved as well, and recovery, you just don't have the time to do it. And so the game has to become a bit blunter, a bit more simplistic. So I think Arteta identified that early, but I also think he realised that, I mean, that almost feels like a negative, but I think the positive side of it is he recognised that one of the early effects of the data revolution was that we undervalued set plays, having previously maybe overvalued them. That just because only 2% of corners leads to goals doesn't mean that corners are worthless. It means you should try and make that 2% into 4%.
See, I still would say that Arsenal, actually more than any other club, including Guardiola City, given that they're now going through a transition, they still play the positional game. And it's still, when he has all his best attackers available, it's still what you see. So against Forest, which did feel actually a bit of a significant performance in September, that was kind of the Arsenal of 22-23. They had Forest pinned back right in their area for basically the entirety of both halves. And of course, it's not coincidence that, Odegaard, is back and he's got so many players available. And the reason why they did that much less last year was because of this issue related to the calendar, where they had so many injuries and they're missing many of their best attackers throughout that. So one solution was Arteta leaning more on these more pragmatic. Like I think it does come down to giving Arsenal an extra face rather than just changing what they are completely, giving them extra elements. So that was the first solution. He did become more pragmatic when he didn't have his best attackers available. The second solution was basically what they did this summer, which was, because it doesn't really seem like Arteta's going to change his approach maybe in terms of his solution to injuries essentially has been to sign a lot more players. And this is why I do think Arsenal will win either the League or the Champions League this year, because I think when it gets to November to January and there are games every 3 days, he's basically got 2 high quality 11s. It doesn't matter which arrangement of players. There's 22 players there or whatever, or 21 that can form 2 really good sides to go from Saturday to Wednesday, and also sustain a certain type of approach, even if you have missing players. And the other factor in that is that actually, so Arteta has made his squad bigger, but unlike Liverpool, who've changed the substance of the first 11 and changed a lot of the core of the first 11, Arteta still has his core there. And I suppose this is where you get into the idea of where a team cycle has to have a moment where they eventually win, because Arteta still has that core group. So he's got everything they know, and on top of that, he's put on this kind of extra depth, whereas both City and Liverpool are actually changing the core of their side.
Yeah, you see this a lot actually on kind of Liverpool, Arsenal inflected Twitter, where Arsenal fans are furious. That, it's an online subsection. It's not representative of the fan base at all. But there's a subsection of Arsenal fans who really take exception to the idea that anyone should say Liverpool are in transition. their evidence for this is that Arsenal, I think, signed more players this summer. But I think that very obviously, and I would say willfully, neglects two fairly key elements, one of which is that Liverpool are trying to change the way they play. Like there is a change in emphasis in Liverpool's system. And the other is that most of the players who Arsenal signed aren't going in the first choice team. Like that, the first team, Arsenal remained the same. They just have that added depth. And maybe because of Eze, a little bit more variety in kind of who takes the creative burdens. I think Miguel's completely right that what undid them last season wasn't just that Liverpool kind of kept churning out results. It was the fact that for most of the campaign, Arsenal didn't have Odegaard and Saka in the same team, that they missed a lot of football between them. And if you shut them down, Arsenal, or if they weren't there, Arsenal were weaker. This season, they very much give the impression that for home games against West Ham and Nottingham Forest, they don't need Odegaard and Saka on the pitch necessarily, and across both competitions. That means you can kind of go much further and sustain your levels. But I think it's that depth and that ability to lean on set pieces, perhaps when other options aren't working, that makes Arsenal the perfect avatar for the modern Premier League, that makes them the most modern team in the league, doesn't it? Because they can play wonderful football if they need to, or if everyone's fit to do it. But they've acknowledged that the reality of the modern game is that you just need to. It's an ongoing slog. You just need to battle through it, and the way you do that is partly by kind of using your mortars. You get people to lob corners at Gabriel's head, and the other is you just take the approach of the Red Army, just cannon fodder, just keep feeding bodies into the meat grinder because players are going to get injured. That's what makes Arsenal ideally suited, really, to, in a way that probably Liverpool and City aren't, to win the league this season because they have both of those elements in place already. But I want to come back to the thing about the mood around Arsenal, because I think that's interesting as well. So let's have a little bit of a break, bit of a breather, and then we'll unleash our bias sides. So we've flicked a little bit at the frenzy surrounding Arsenal, which I think is difficult to deny, that everything feels, as Miguel said, I think, like a referendum on Arteta, on whether this team can win, whether they can get over the line. But is that not really natural, given that not only that they finished second 3 years in a row, but Arsenal now haven't won a Premier League title for 21 years. And that's quite a long time. You know, when Liverpool were 20 years into their wait for a title, that was quite a big thing. People kept talking about it in a way that they don't necessarily with Arsenal. But to Arsenal fans, that wait is going to feel like a lifetime rather than a generation.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I guess maybe the reason we don't talk about it is they were not the dominant side. You know, there was this period when they and United were vying for the title, but it was never that Arsenal were dominant in the way Liverpool had been in the 80s. You know, in the 80s, it was almost inconceivable that Liverpool would have to wait 20-odd years for a title, in the same way that United had to wait 20-odd years after the great success of Busby's side. So, I mean, Arsenal haven't been the dominant side in England since the 1930s, and you have a legacy of Chapman's side and Tom Whittaker. So in that sense, it's a 90-year wait for dominance, and that's what we should be focusing on.
In Fever Pitch, in both the book and the film I quite like, actually, the Mark First character, who is, of course,
Nick Hornby?
David, yes. One of the most famous writers in England.
Colin Firth. You said something else, didn't you?
Mark, yeah.
Did I? Okay.
Yeah.
Mark, I conflated Mark Strong and Colin Firth. Because Mark Strong actually
is also in it, yeah.
Yeah. But he goes on about how, I've never, have you ever waited for anything in your life for 18 years? And obviously, that felt massive, obviously, in kind of the build up to 89, from 71 to 89. And now, they've already sailed past 18 years to make it 21. But I think that's an interesting one, actually, because while Arsenal are probably, in fact, I would say definitely England's third biggest club, you can see actually in title wins, you can see it in how that translates into worldwide support, certainly in terms of kind of quote unquote numbers online. Certainly post-war, which is, I suppose, when we consider modern football, maybe, not quite anymore. They've never had a dominant era. So their one dominant era was really the 1930s, Whereas both Manchester United and Liverpool, the two other members of the Red Cartel, they've actually had long stretches. And also, they've not just had long stretches, of course, they've been European champions in those periods. Well, Arsenal have been this force, they've been a quote-unquote an establishment club, the Grand Arsenal. Ferguson used to talk about like the kind of the marble halls and all that. Their modern success is quite fragmented. And even Wenger, I mean, we brought this up in the Wenger pod if people want to go back to it. Like, that's only 3 league titles across over 2 decades in England.
A failure. I mean, Wenger was a failure. No question. No, I think the European champion point is interesting because, I mean, Arsenal are by a mile the biggest club never to have won the European Cup.
Yeah.
Especially now that PSG...
and they're bigger than PSG.
Yeah, they are. But, at the same time, you then get into Paris is a massive city. There's just one team, one major team in it. Arsenal are historically bigger than PSG without question, but that is a big hole on their CV for a club of that size. I think there are 2 other relevant factors in why that 21-year wait outside Arsenal isn't so pronounced. Like, it's not such a focus. One is that they have won the Premier League. They've won the Premier League under Wenger. Liverpool's success predated the Premier League. 1990 obviously was before year 0 and the birth of modern football, birth of actual football. Whereas Arsenal, they've won 3 Premier League titles. They've never been missing from that list. It's not, you've not had that thing of, Blackburn have won the Premier League, but you haven't. And the other is that I think we maybe forget that 2004 is quite a long time ago, because a lot of people who lead the conversation are roughly our age and don't really want to accept that 2004 is almost a quarter of a century ago. Just that was our prime.
I think that's absolutely true. Myself and the enemy of the podcast, Mark Ogden, self-professed enemy of the podcast, at half-time of the Liverpool game, the one they lost in August, we were discussing how the Liverpool fans were singing with real relish at them, "Where's your European Cup?" And that's happened. I think, was City singing the same thing as well at them? Because obviously City had it thanked to them for years. But I suppose on the point about kind of the wait for Arsenal to win, it does feel it's more about Arteta and the idea of being a winner than it is about, well, you haven't won for 21 years.
That's true. I think, whereas with Liverpool, and I don't want to, this isn't a Liverpool thing, but with Liverpool, it became very much the institution, not the manager. It was, what is it about this institution that can't get over the line? Whereas with Arsenal, it feels very much like Arteta needs to win something to prove that, all of his groundwork has been worth it, that this is going somewhere, that second isn't his ceiling. There is, without question, it's interesting, Midge, you said at the start about Arsenal's dressing room are quite touchy about the way they're covered. There is a section of their online fan base, certainly, who are extraordinarily touchy about the way they're covered. And I think at the Emirates, you can detect a real kind of frenzy when things aren't going as they want. It does feel like a very nervous place, in the same way as White Hart Lane and Goodison were always, as an outsider, it always felt like those stadiums were really ready to turn on their teams at the first hint of disappointment. Arsenal, there's a kind of mania at the Emirates, and I felt it in the PSG semi-final last year, where you sort of thought this place is too emotional. Like, you need a degree of cool and composure in those moments. And the Emirates does not have it. Does it feel so like, we need to do this now? It has to be now. Come on, it's now. And I think the big failing for me of Arteta is that he doesn't damp that down. He stokes it. I think a lot of it comes from him being so manic on the touchline that it creates this kind of nervous energy around the team. And I do believe that makes a difference in those really tense, sort of decisive moments.
I know there's a very famous and senior manager who has apparently made that exact point about Arteta, that he's too emotional on the touchline. The one thing I would say in contrast to that, though, is he more emotional than Pep Guardiola? It's not like he sinks to his knees when suddenly a counterattack develops. But of course,
well, where did he learn it from?
But then I suppose, to be fair, because this has come up with Guardiola, in a league campaign, you can correct errors, especially when you are the modern Manchester City. Whereas in the Champions League, it has exactly been said that in games where they need control, the players are maybe, glance at the sideline, and there's Guardiola going, doing what he does. And that has possibly manifested in the fact that Guardiola has only won 3 Champions League when he should have won 6 or 7.
The world's sexiest man, Dominic Szoboszlai, said to Roger Bennett, who I do Men in Blazers with, last year, that Rog asked him about kind of what's the difference between looking at the touchline and seeing Klopp going nuts. Just Klopp was just as kind of animated as Arteta is, and people didn't really hold that against him. It was seen as a positive, and there is a hypocrisy there, I think. compared to Slot. Just Slot is quite impassive on the touchline, except when he loses, when he gets very crotchety. And Szoboszlai said then, this was early on before Slot had won the title with Liverpool, so there was still kind of doubts around him. Szoboszlai said, I see a man who's in control and has a plan. And I think that was kind of the vibe with Liverpool last season. Like, this guy's got it. We know what we're doing. He knows what he's doing. This will be all right. And I do wonder whether, maybe with Guardiola and to an extent with Klopp, maybe when the players look across and see someone going nuts, they think, well, it's okay that he's going nuts because this worked. This guy has done it before. Even if in early Klopp seasons it was, this guy's done it in the Bundesliga.
Yeah.
But bear in mind, by 2018 with Klopp, all right, he hadn't won the league, but he'd been there 2 years and he got Liverpool to the Champions League final. That's going to engender belief in whatever he's doing works. Arteta doesn't have that. And as harsh as that is, I wonder if the players respond to that as well.
But it does come back to that classic thing that we have also mentioned in the podcast before. You can basically say and do anything you want within reason or the law as long as you're winning. And in this case, that idea, so like, because that's been said about like Brendan Rodgers quotes say, when he was top of the league, they sound inspirational. When suddenly they're dropping to fifth, they sound absurd. And that whole idea is then it's kind of extrapolated out to not just to winning games, but to winning trophies.
I think that's particularly true of criticism of referees. That when you're winning, he's putting pressure on referees. He's making sure that they keep getting the decisions. Whereas when you're losing, he's looking for an excuse. And I think I was at the Bournemouth game last season when Saliba was sent off. And it seemed to me very obvious Arteta was trying to play down. He wasn't saying the decision was right, but he wasn't it clearly was right. I don't know why there's even a discussion about it, but he seemed deliberately to be trying to say, that's not the issue. That's not why we lost. Whereas you compare that to, say, the Newcastle games the season before, when there was sort of 3 half reasons why he could have ruled out the Newcastle goal and it wasn't. And there seemed to be some sort of logic of, well, if there's 3 half reasons to rule it out, that means it's 1.5 times not a goal. Therefore, we should get half a goal for it. And he was very much sort of fanning the flames of that. I think he appeared to me in that game, in that Bournemouth game, that he'd taken a very conscious decision that playing up a referee conspiracy thing is actually creating negative energy, and there's nothing you can do about it. You got to just accept it and move on with it. I think he's slightly sort of regressed from that with certain comments and certain elements of his behaviour since. But I think it's telling that he appeared to have noticed that was going on.
Yeah, well, again, we've said it here before as well. We know, like we said in the online episode, I know that online memes about refs and all this sort of thing, or these mad tweets that kind of like show, certain decisions or bias, they have made their way to the Arsenal dressing room. I think what's really fascinating as well about how this whole idea of the atmosphere around the club and the anxiety of the crowd. So Arteta this is one thing I would say about Arsenal as well. They are a very progressive club in the sense that they look and use the science on every single detail. Hence, we've seen this with set pieces. But another aspect of that is Arteta himself, who I don't think has the natural managerial charisma of a Guardiola or obviously a Ferguson or Klopp, really. He's got that kind of modern intensity rather than that charisma. He's really interested in kind of how you can nuance the psychology of a team. So hence, that's why there are very specific reasons why he has said things that are basically mocked online and in the media, like we were the best team and all this sort of, we're the best team in Europe. And that is the idea that his own players don't fixate on debates where flaws are illustrated. So there's an element to kind of this whole thing of manifestation. And similarly, so when they were going through like last season when they had all those injuries, and he'd be asked about those injuries, he would say things like, well, actually, I'm proud of the players of getting through this. It really shows their character. So it's a very conscious attempt to spin those debates. But I think that, and actually I do think that's possibly important within this kind of mania around Arsenal. But then, of course, it all kind of feeds into this cloud of constant discussion around the team, especially if his comments are then, in turn, mocked, as they very much were after the Paris Saint-Germain game.
Well, yeah, and it opens you up to the kind of cynicism of the general English football environment, which is that anything that is new must be terrible and cringe. So you think of the pickpockets. I mean, win the dog. As a dog lover, very much pro win the dog, but to other people, it might look like, to quote James Horncastle, he's a gimmicky Basque Brendan. But the difference there, and Rodgers is a great example of this, that, you remember in the Being Liverpool documentary, there was that, the envelope thing, which Rodgers was, well, it was kind of, whoa, what a joke. This guy's this guy's ridiculous. Ferguson used the same thing. He got it from Ferguson. What's the difference?
But and also on that as well, like the stuff like the light bulb. Well, is that not just a modern version of Ferguson? Like Rio Ferdinand have spoken about how, he's going to do the geese story again.
Yeah.
Like Ferguson used to keep himself up at night thinking of kind of motivational stories that he could tell the players. And I think like this is a bit of a modern equivalent of that, with the crucial difference. For Alex Ferguson is the most successful manager of all time, whereas Arteta has an FA Cup.
So there is a world in which, and I think certainly two of us are of the view that it'll come this season, where Arteta wins the Premier League, or I guess the Champions League, maybe both. And all of this the tone of it changes completely. And I don't know, I suppose to me, that is unfair. That's inherent. As much as I'm guilty of it, I think that's unfair, because if you look at the work that he's done, what if City win the title this season because of a shot that goes, a metre over, half a foot over the line, or Arsenal hit the post in the 95th minute of a crucial game? Is that really enough to change the whole texture of the debate around Arteta in particular and Arsenal in general?
Yes and no. I mean, that just is what football is. In the same way that, from our perspective now, we would say Jurgen Klopp's one of the great Premier League managers. In 20 years, 30 years, people are going to go, that German bloke who won one league title, why was he such a big deal? That is just what football is. And it's our responsibility as journalists or historians to try and represent the full picture. But equally, you can spin that the other way. The greatest FA Cup story of all in 1973. It's the first time I've mentioned it. This is like episode 60 or something. Come on.
Is it the first time? There's been floating references around it.
Not from me, there hasn't. But that wouldn't have been, if Peter Lawren was shot, it's hit Jim Montgomery's wrists and it cannoned up onto the bar and bounced down over the line rather than 3 feet in front of the line, which would only be a difference, I don't know, like 4 degrees or something. I don't know what it would have taken, but not much. Suddenly, it's just Leeds end up steamrolling a plucky lower division team, but it's not. It's the greatest fairy story of all time. So there's a lot of those fairy stories. The original Brothers Grimm ones, they're a bit weird. Like,
and then celebrating Sunderland doing something is a bit weird. I agree with that. I think that is it comes down to fine margins, but I just wonder whether the consequences of those fine margins now are different in terms of the fact that we have sat here and happily discussed whether Matt Busby was a loser because he came fourth in four times in 4 years, second four times in 4 years. I'm having a nightmare with our numbers. I mean, I think in 20 years' time, just to be clear, no one is discussing Klopp because, as I think Jacob Hawley made the point on Screen Rot the other day, the real battle in football is now whether your online fans can insult our online fans more. So no one will be talking about Klopp. They'll be saying, do you remember that time that guy said Gyökeres looks like he's playing in jeans? That is what will be happening in 20 years' time. And it will all just be AI slop washing over us.
Arsenal fans won't like this comparison, but I think it's an instructive one. For me, one of the best achievements in the Premier League, and I'm saying the Premier League history, is Pochettino getting Tottenham to 86 points. That, if you get really dull with it and look at the history of the club, the maths, the wages, the kind of the idea of how, wage bill correlates to your position and points return, that shouldn't really have been possible. I thought it was extreme overperformance. He's unlucky that he's up against Abramovich's Chelsea, and that is a title that's now been kind of, clouded by this investigation into the Abramovich era. But, Pochettino is considered also a loser and a second place, a bottler and all this, because he didn't translate that into victory. Then, I was thinking in terms of what Arteta could do. Well, he could easily just leave Arsenal at the end of the season, go to some wealthier European club, win a gimme title. Would that make him a winner? For Pochettino, he went to PSG. Now, actually, I've meant to undermine my own point, because, of course, Pochettino lost the title to Lille, which shouldn't really happen at Paris Saint-Germain.
But at least, Miguel, you've given us our episode title for engagement, which is Can Arteta Emulate Pochettino? That is the way that we're going to hook people into this episode. You got to wait for it, but it's there. I think we'll leave it there. Jonathan, you need to have breakfast. Miguel, your ransom has been paid and you are allowed to leave your hotel. Safe flight home. I take it you're at a game at the weekend. Where are you going?
Liverpool, Manchester United.
You're making the trek up to Anfield. Jonathan, are you going to Sarmiento or someone?
Sarmiento were good on Sunday. I enjoyed that. I mean, they were lucky to win that game, but the way River folded. I mean, Gajardo's under pressure now. He's lost 6 of the last 7. River, since they got promoted in 2012, it's been success after success after success. This is the first time that there's real doubt cast on the project. At the very moment when I'm filming a documentary about them and about how great they are.
This is the Wilson equivalent of the Smith of Death. Right, we'll leave it there as Jonathan curses River Plate. Thank you for listening. Like, subscribe, rate, review, all that stuff. We'll see you next week.